there's a rabid dog running around your neighborhood, you're probably not going to assume something good about that dog.
Well, that analogy used by one Ben Carson comparing some of the Syrian refugees to rabid dogs. The good doctor went on to say we need proper screening mechanisms in place so we know who the mad dogs are. Now, a lot of people upset by that comparison. I can kind of see why, but not to be outdone, Donald Trump, of course, had some of his own things to say here. Hear the Donald.
I watched when the World Trade Center came tumbling down. And I watched in Jersey City, New Jersey, where thousands and thousands of people were cheering as that building was coming down.
You know, the police say that didn't happen, and all those rumors have been on the internet for some time. So did you misspeak
it did
yesterday?
Happen. I saw it. It was
you saw that with your own eye?
Okay, just for a little bit of context and maybe facts, let's hear what the mayor of Jersey City had to say about that.
There is no line there that he's reluctant to cross, and even when he knows it's a lie. So, you know, from my standpoint, you got to say it's one of two things. Either he's willfully making up lies, or he has memory issues. And if you have either one of those, you have to question his ability to be president.
And trust me, there's more from Trump trying to shut down mosques here, religious tests for folks that would come in. I'd love to know how you're going to exercise that one, let alone the efficacy of it. But anyway, no matter what Trump says, it's not hurting him in the polls here. In fact, it's helping him. He's holding a 10-point lead now over Carson. Then there's another big drop-off when you go to Marco Rubio, who's in third place. And before you say, oh, you know, it's still early. Well, we're late November right now, so it's, as Yogi Berra used to say, it's getting late early. All right, let's bring it up panel right now. Evan Siegfried. Evan's a Republican strategist and president of SOM Consulting. Noam Bramson, Democratic mayor of New Rochelle. Guys, thank you so much for the time. Okay. Evan, every Republican consultant that I've brought on, I think, wishing Trump would go away. But now, even when Republican voters are asked, who do you trust most on national security, going away, Trump is the preferred candidate, even when you have somebody with the bona fides of Jeb Bush or whatever in the field. That's his strongest calling card. And he has said some crazy stuff about what's going on, not just in the Middle East, but what we should do about people, even Americans here, who happen to have a faith that is Muslim. How does the party explain here that his 15 minutes keep going on and on and on?
Well, first of all, I think you're looking at it the wrong way. He's not passing 30% in the polls, which means that 70% of Republicans are rejecting him. So there are Republicans who realize this guy is not good. Right now, we have a very large and crowded field, and support is going to other candidates: Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, Jeb Bush, John Kasich, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Would you tell the truth, Evan? If I came to you at the beginning of August and said, okay, we see where he is now, late November, right before Thanksgiving, who's the leader in the Republican field? Would you still have said Trump? You would have thought he would have faded by now, right?
It kind of depends upon, I mean, if the field were smaller, I would have said yes. But now I wouldn't say that back then. And as much as I wish that he had gone away, he's sort of like a bad girlfriend. But, you know, Donald Trump is not helping the party, and everything he has to say, including a database for Muslims, just confound the mind. And it's also counter to the values of the United States.
To that end, I know you're going to agree, but it is scary that some people saw this, the Ted Cruzes of the world, and saw some traction on this issue. There hasn't been broad condemnation by Republicans, some, but not by a lot of Republicans for this. And before it's just labeling on Republicans, what does it say, though, Mr. Mayor, about where we are as a country when in 2015 here, people are talking about Muslim databases, screening people for their religions, the idea of comparing refugees to rabid dogs. And these are, as the primary process is about to begin, two of the leaders of a political party. And before we just pass it off as Republicans here, I think he's speaking to an undercurrent, hopefully a minority in this country, that's going back to some really scary times in this country where we look back with shame that we didn't do the right thing. I just don't put it at two crazy guys trying to score points in a political process.
Well, it's a good question and an important question, and I'd say Trump is not just leading the polls on the Republican side, he's leading the conversation. In fact, just to Evan's point, he may be getting 30% in the polls, but if you add in Carson's vote and you add in Cruz's vote and you add in the others who are not establishment candidates by traditional definitions, you're talking about a supermajority of the Republican electorate. Look, right-wing populism is not a new phenomenon in America. You can go back to Joe McCarthy, you can go back to George Wallace. I mean, my goodness, Pat Buchanan won the New Hampshire primary in 1996. Takes a little bit of a different form with each generation and each character, but there are sort of common strains that link them all. There's xenophobia, there's a mistrust of traditional institutions, there's a sense that if we just had a strong person knocking heads together, then complex issues are going to become simple.
But I've heard that one. What I haven't heard so proudly said, then doubled down on is, let's do religious tests. And I'm not trying to make this a history class, but what was the whole point? They went across the Atlantic to come here for religious freedom, to escape religious persecution. And the idea that we're having debates and people doubling down on the idea that, well, Christians can come in this country, non-Christians can't. And not to let facts get in the way, how exactly are you going to prove somebody's religious fealty? Okay. But
there was a nice
I'm trying to make too much sense.
There was a nice exchange with Jeb Bush on exactly that question. Which
right,
was actually
and
great.
we haven't always done right by refugees in this country. Just talk to Jews after World War II. I mean, but how many times do we have to learn this lesson to hear this garbage?
I agree, and the truth is our values don't count for very much if we're going to retreat for them when it's hard. Adhering to values only when it's easy doesn't mean very much. And this is exactly when you want leaders to step up and affirm what America's all about. But what I want to say is, although this general phenomenon is not new, what is new is for this kind of populism, this kind of right-wing populism, to have such a strong claim on one of our major American parties. And if you are someone who believes that what Donald Trump stands for ain't so good for America, then that should be a source of real concern.
And I do want to say, though, that maybe it kind of filled a vacuum because the president was called tone deaf by critics, and I got to say, I didn't think he went nearly hard enough. And yes, I know it's not just muscular and beating the chest to talk tough and you're going to do everything, but he was dismissive of critics who I thought maybe I didn't agree with, but I think there was legitimate concerns about security issues, especially in the aftermath of one of those guys having a Syrian passport, whether it was real or not. Let me remind you what the president had to say.
We have always understood that this would be a long-term campaign. There will be setbacks and there will be successes. The terrible events in Paris were obviously a terrible and sickening setback.
Evan, I think there's an opening here for Republicans. Unfortunately, for Republicans, Donald Trump has filled that opening, Ben Carson right behind him. Hillary clearly distanced herself from the president. I mean, she was polite about it, but at the end of the day, she says the strategy is not working with ISIS and we have to do more, certainly more than the president did. I mean, I just look at it from a political standpoint. The president didn't get it right the first time. Republicans were right to jump, but the wrong people were doing the talking.
Yeah, the president from day one on ISIS has just been a disaster. In February, his State Department proposed a solution to ISIS of, well, if we get them jobs, then they won't want to attack us. ISIS is a radical Islamic group that wants to kill us for just being Americans. And you're not going to solve that by giving them jobs. On the day of the Paris attacks, the morning of that, the president had said that ISIS was contained. A few hours later, we saw not only had they not been contained, but they were expanding to Paris. And then
his point, and I grant you, it certainly the time was awful for him, but his point was they were contained on a geographic standpoint, and their footprint was starting to get smaller in the Middle East. But people took it to say.
And they remain 30 miles outside of Baghdad, occupying, I believe, Fallujah. Now, when you start looking at the candidates and where they are on how to handle ISIS, the majority of them on the Republican side are pretty much in agreement. We need to be doing airstrikes. We need to put in special operations forces. Marco Rubio has a very detailed plan himself, which
But if you follow his plan and where it goes, not just the presence of ground troops here, but a direct line that if Russia, in effect, violates basically our no-fly zone and everything else, not just where Hillary, he goes a step further, where we're talking World War III here. So how far in the vacuum the president may have done, at least from a tonal standpoint, I don't know who's right and wrong for giving the people what they want. Forget when the anger simmers a little bit. Do we want ground troops in Syria? How much of a commitment are we really willing to engage there? I mean, I've heard a lot of stuff here. I'm curious, from your vantage point, who's the closest to the American public in terms of appetite?
Well, I think the only presidential candidate who has laid out a coherent plan is Hillary Clinton, who I think has done an extraordinary job in her speech at the Council of Foreign Relations of describing the complexities of the situation in Syria and the surrounding region, and of describing the different steps that the United States needs to take in order to have a measurable impact on results. If all you want to do is send in troops and use a direct military response against ISIS while ignoring the larger context, you're not learning the lessons of Iraq. And I think those lessons need to be incorporated in whatever we do going forward. So did the president get the tone wrong? Absolutely. And I think it reflects a certain impatience that he has in what he might perceive as posturing. And yet when you're dealing with a situation that really touches people at an emotional
Theater's
level,
a part of it.
You've got to be able to express that. Otherwise, folks will not get the substance of what you're saying. But in terms of moving forward, I think Hillary Clinton has it right, and the Republican field is offering nothing but simplistic solutions.
I've got to just quickly disagree with the mayor here. Hillary Clinton is playing defense because she is being faulted within nonpartisan foreign policy circles for helping to create ISIS with her disastrous advice on Libya the first go-around. And there are Republican candidates. Again, if you go and you read Marco Rubio's plan, which is available on his campaign website, he talks about economic pressure, stopping lone wolves. He understands it's a complex and dynamic thing. I don't think that complexity being recognized by Democrats.
I'll let that be the last one because I want to have time for this next debate on the other side. Closer to home here, Princeton, the latest school dealing with student protests over race. But this one, different than the others, you'll want to hear why.